This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast. Each week, we look at how high net worth families can improve their lives, decisions, and investments in a deeply uncertain world. We always aim to provide practical information, even if we can't offer specific investment advice. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Definitely Uncertain podcast, brought to you by Goldrock Capital, the 20-year-old multifamily office servicing high net worth families around the world. Today on the podcast, I'm very pleased to have my partner and founder of Goldrock Capital, Daniel Goldman, join us again. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, everybody.
Great to have you back on the show. Thanks. We are going to be talking today about an element of wealth and wealth management that doesn't always get discussed so much within the family office world, and that's philanthropy and the role of families, the social responsibility that families have in the philanthropic world. Daniel has carved out a niche for himself over the last few years, apart from his role at Goldrock Capital, helping managing families in doing exactly that. And so we wanted to have Daniel on the show to talk a little bit about his experiences and some of the lessons that he's learned over the journey he's taken in the last 20 years. Daniel, we're going through a tough economic period now. The corona shutdowns, the recession, that's all put a real toll on families globally around the world, here in Israel and elsewhere. From your view, what is the role of high net worth families in a period like this?
So I can obviously speak personally from my experience and also the things that I've learned from my parents and particularly from my dad. And we very much believed that if you were fortunate enough to be in a position where you had wealth, then part of your responsibility to society was to use that for the betterment of that society and other people. By the way, it's important to understand, and I know you know this as well from your own family background, that this is something that you do whether you have money or don't have money. It's just a question of what you can use in order to make it work the best it can.
When a family approaches this question, particularly at a time like this, should there be complete flexibility? Should a family say, look, a needy person walks up to the door, we're going to help them out? Or on the other, taking it to the other extreme, should it be a more strategic approach where you have specific goals and you really just stick to them?
I think in regular times, it's perfectly acceptable for families of major wealth to, as you would call it, strategically think about their philanthropy and focus down on the areas that are of interest to them. And it doesn't really matter for the purposes of our debate, whether we're talking about children with special needs or, the safety of wild animals or, education, health, whatever those things are, to be focused on that. I do think that in a period of crisis, and we're in a period of health and economic crisis almost everywhere in the world, we should be opening our minds to consider what are the other things that we are called upon to do in this moment of crisis, and how we should act differently at that moment.
How should a family act differently? What are some of the things that have been going through your mind and the mind of philanthropists with whom you're in contact?
So as you can probably imagine, over the last 3 months, I've been in touch with a tremendous number of organizations who are working in the field on the one hand, and pretty large philanthropic foundations on the other. What really comes out of these discussions are a couple of important insights, which I must say I have been pleasantly surprised relative to previous crises that we've been through financially over the last sort of 10 to 20 years. And the key, I think the key thing that we can learn from the response of major philanthropy this time around is they have understood that specifically the beneficiary organizations that they fund are in crisis, and therefore the foundations need to show a level of flexibility as to how they go about the funding process, number one. And number two, we've seen collectively foundations coming together to develop sort of corona funds, dedicated allocations of big money that are specifically directed at the problems arising from corona itself.
And how does the philanthropic world unwind from that position? So there is a sort of band-aid that needs to be applied, a tourniquet, because the world's bleeding, but then we move back towards perhaps more business as usual for philanthropists and foundations?
So I think the first thing to recognize is that the situation that we're in, the lack of clarity about where we're going to be socially, financially, health-wise, etc., is going to be, I think, an ongoing issue. It's not going to stop now at the end of the first phase. And the way that we are looking at it, and a lot of the other people in the philanthropic arena are really considering out maybe even to the end of 2021 as the period during which this uncertainty is going to continue. This obviously has important ramifications as foundations sit down and consider what they are going to be doing in the next year to a year and a half. So things that maybe they were previously planning had there been no corona, I think are going to be put on the back burner, and instead of which they're going to dedicate and be more focused on the areas that they have chosen to be in light of the crisis situation.
Let's go back to your personal journey, which has been 20 years. Started off, I think it'd be true to say, with a very broad mandate, and over time really narrowed down where today, I think it's fair to say you've become a subject expert in the world of in the integration of the ultra-Orthodox into Israeli society, which has been your chosen field. During that process, was that a difficult transition for you? You had to, I assume, leave good causes along the way where you'd previously been supporting them and you were no longer. How did that work?
Going back indeed as far back as 20 years when my dad passed away, I think the major change that I have gone through was right at the beginning of that. And you'll remember a little bit like it was with the starters at the time. Every good cause that approached in that early period, I felt obliged in some way to assist, because I hadn't really developed for myself the filter that says, this is what I do want to do, and this is what I don't want to do. I think over time, what I have tried to develop for myself, and I would highly recommend other people doing the same, is appreciating the fact that you're not necessarily responsible for everything in the world. And whilst one wants to do as much good as you can, I think there is a limit. In fact, we have a saying of our own that one must always strive to do as much as possible, but recognize that you can never be, you can never fully take responsibility for everything. I think this allows you to then focus in on the things which you have a passion for, a knowledge for, something that you can develop over time, and over and above the giving aspect of the philanthropy, you then actually become an activist in the area where you're capable of giving as well. I think that's something which I've tried to develop on. You're right in saying that you have to make decisions about areas then that you do not focus on. What I've done to try and help there is, so that I don't feel too bad about myself, is you can always leave some money and allocate it. Maybe it's a lesser amount of money, so that things which you like but are outside of your say specialist area, you can continue to be a sort of more passive giver, and of course keep money aside for people who are sick, people who have come on hard times, etc. You never ever want to lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, all of this giving is in order to alleviate people's difficult positions that they are in.
That moves philanthropy out of the realm of giving or check writing into something more active, the way that you describe it, certainly.
Yeah, and I think if we put our professional hats on as family officers, we've discussed this any number of times over the years about the challenges that our clients have as wealth moves from sort of wealth creation generation to wealth preservation generation. The idea that the same sorts of passions around business building will appear in the second generation as they do in the first generation are often very unrealistic. And so as not every time, but as a potential replacement for that, I think activism through philanthropy is something which can bring you a similar type of passion than maybe our fathers or grandfathers or grandmothers had around building the family initially. And so I think from a family office perspective, it should always be something which we take into account, because more than the good causes need us, we need the good causes in order to develop that passion.
And there are parallels between the way you give and the way that you invest, in the sense that in your chosen area, where you build your expertise, you're going to do much better due diligence. You're going to choose the better manager. You're going to choose the more appropriate way of getting your money to the right end user, or the right, quote unquote investment, so that you get the best return.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that people who focus in a particular area and understand that ecosystem and how it works, and again, it really doesn't matter whether it's developing health systems in Africa or education in Israel, or any topic that you could consider. The more of a deep dive you do into that area, the more likely it is that your investment in philanthropy is going to be more impactful. And I would also say, at the end of the day, your personal satisfaction from actually doing the philanthropy will only grow, which hopefully will not just encourage you, but those that are around you, other family members, to say, hey, I'd like to have a piece of that. I'd like to be part of that circle.
You mentioned before the difference between the wealth creator generation, or we call that Gen 1, and Gen 2 and 3 and beyond. In Gen 2 and 3, very often there are more stakeholders, there are more family members. Sometimes there's a mix of generations with very different desires, perhaps different issues that speak to them. Gen 1 might be interested in education, and Gen 2 environmental matters. How do you balance those different family demands, those priorities in the giving program?
The simple answer to that is, in a similar way as you would in any sort of family governance issue, relating to wealth, is I think each family has to sort of consider how best to bring those desires and passions to the fore. So you could have a situation where there could be family agreement that actually the things which were important to Gen 1, and without naming names, I can certainly think of one family foundation that basically has taken a snapshot of exactly what the wealth creator did over several decades of philanthropy, and broadly has continued almost exactly the same beneficiaries, not just the same areas, but the same beneficiaries. They've continued that a decade or two after the death of the family founder, and it's legit, it's fine. On the flip side, and maybe in the extreme to the other way, you could say, well, okay, we have children of this family, or maybe even grandchildren, and each one of them should be entitled to develop the passion that they want to do and go out and build something, or be active in that area. And I think there is a middle way that says, okay, there are ideas around family values which do get passed and replicated from generation to generation. And I think it's an important component of keeping that family together. And at the same time, you can say, well, we will also allocate funds or resource, or we're going to send next generation people out to do things on their own, because in the end, we want to balance between that continuity of flow through the generations and the ability for each member of the family to, bring himself to express his own ideas and passions within the philanthropy and the activism that he has.
Well, Daniel Goldman, thank you very, very much for sharing that. We thank you all for listening. This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast. Please give us feedback. We've got great feedback from people watching and listening to the podcast, whether it's on YouTube or on iTunes so far. So please do email at podcasts@goldrockcap.com. Thanks very much for listening, everybody.